Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, live on CBS Sports Network. Well, the national championship was last night, which means it's already time to start ranking teams. No, not from the season that just finished, for the one that's going to start in about 140 some odd days, because that's just the way that we do things. But we do have a lot of the information that we're going to have, with most of the recruiting classes getting solidified in the early signing period, and a lot of the transfer portal action, as Bud mentioned earlier, maybe not being as landscape shifting as we would expect now that a lot of teams are able to utilize NIL to secure their best players and avoid that type of bleeding out, especially for the teams at the very, very top. And the very, very top is where we are going to have our focus. So, Bud, why don't you take us through your way too early top 10 for 2025?
All right, the Bud Elliott super official way too early top 10 for 2025. We are starting at the top. Number 1, the Ohio State Buckeyes. They lose a lot. They don't lose Downs. They don't lose Smith. I don't know anybody covers Smith, and Downs is an eraser. Number 2, Penn State. You get Drew Aller right there. Get a whole lot of guys back. Both backs are back. I think that could be a really special Penn State team. Georgia still has a lot of young talent that was not draft eligible. I think they'll have some improvement on the offensive line. So they're there. 3, Oregon. I like a lot of what they have coming back. Texas, ditto. Texas was higher for me, by the way, before they had that big exodus to the draft, including both starting tackles. Clemson at 6. Probably not like a legit top 16 this year, but they bring back so much. I'm projecting a little bit of improvement there. Notre Dame 7. Honestly, I could have had Notre Dame anywhere between like 3 and 9. So 7's kind of splitting the difference. Kansas State, I think they'll take a nice jump this year. That's maybe an outlier with somebody else's rankings. LSU and then Tennessee. Some of this SEC stuff at the end is going to be interesting. People are going to have, as we'll see probably with y'all, maybe some different SEC teams. But that's going to be one of the big questions of the season. Which of these young SEC quarterbacks actually becomes a stud? Like a real stud, not a theoretical stud.
My top 10 looks a little different than yours, although I do want to point out the most important thing here is that this is way, way too early to be putting together a top 10 for next year. But hey, we're here, right? My number 1, just like Bud's, is Ohio State. When I went through the exercise, like part of it, I'm sitting there like, I don't know who the number 1 team will be to start next year, but I know which team just won a national title 24 hours ago. So I'm just going to throw them there and wait until somebody knocks them off. Texas, I understand your questions, Bud, about their offensive line, but we saw some injuries on that line in the postseason, and guys like Goolsby and others who stepped in looked pretty dang good, and I think Sark's done a very good job recruiting that position. You throw in some Arch Manning, and I think that these Longhorns are going to be pretty dang good again next year. Penn State, we talked about it earlier, how Ohio State's got to replace a lot of guys. The Nittany Lions have lost a couple receivers to the transfer portal, but hey, they were never part of the offense anyway. So I still think Penn State's going to be pretty good next year. Notre Dame, a lot of returning players. We've already talked about it. I expect them to be one of the best teams in the country. Georgia's Georgia. Oregon's Oregon. Clemson will have plenty of experience. Cade Klubnik could prove to be one of the better quarterbacks in the country next year, which will give them a shot to compete. Miami getting Carson Beck. If he's healthy, I think that they have a pretty solid spot and pretty, compared to other teams, fewer questions at the quarterback position with Beck. I think defensively they have upgraded at the defensive coordinator. They've really revamped their secondary. I think we'll see big steps forward. LSU is still super talented, and I've got Illinois at 10, and you might just think it's a homer thing, but it's a program that won 10 games this year and has 90% of its starters coming back next season. Any other program does that, we're looking at them as a top 10. Illinois is doing it. I'm looking at them as a preseason top 10 team.
Oh, yeah. Tom hitting them with a, if that I was an M, you would never doubt it kind of logic on that one. No, I don't hate it there. Speaking of M, let's take a look at my way too early top 10 for 2025. I, again, am putting Ohio State at number 1, but it really feels like number 1's probably blank, at least for right now. We'll have a little bit more time to get a sense for the kind of turnover that Ohio State is ultimately going to face, but I will have them at the front of the line. For the Texas Longhorns, it is, as you mentioned, Tom, a lot about the fact that Steve Sarkisian has recruited the lines of scrimmage so well that they were even sustaining injuries on the offensive and defensive line and being able to maintain their place in the SEC championship and the college football playoff hunt. Penn State is all about bringing back those key veterans from this year's team that made it all the way to the semifinals. What you get not just from Drew Aller, but from Katron Allen, from Nick Singleton, from Denai Dennis Sutton, should be pretty major. Georgia is Georgia, kind of as you said, but I am very curious to see what ends up happening at the quarterback position and whether or not this Bulldogs team can become a running team again. That ground game was a weakness this year compared to what we've seen from those title teams. They need to solidify that if they want to be able to maintain their top 5 status. Notre Dame sitting there at top 5 feels the stickiest to me, a team that I think will be around that spot throughout most of the season. LSU at 6, I will admit that is a big, big bet on them being able to fix some of their issues on the defensive side of the football, and also on us getting the best of Garrett Nussmeier when he gave us a little bit of an up and down season. Oregon, you stack so many classes like that year over year. I'm going to respect it. Clemson, as you mentioned, Cade Klubnik is going to be maybe one of the most anticipated, quarterback seasons that we will have in the entire country. Then both of the teams that we saw face off against each other on New Year's Eve, Alabama and Michigan. For Alabama, I'm going with Austin Mack as my projected starter there, and a bounce back for a team that had a path to the SEC championship game if they could only, have one forward pass completed in Norman against Oklahoma as a double-digit favorite in a 24-3 loss. And then finally, my big bet, the Michigan Wolverines. I'm going to fast forward them all the way to number 10 because you know who opted out of the bowl game against Alabama? A lot of key Michigan players. Do you know who opted in? A lot of key Alabama players. And when Michigan's backups were pushing around Alabama's starters, then that says to me that the future of the Wolverines is bright, especially when you consider the addition of Bryce Underwood. But any let's see, you can pick apart a Chip list, a Tom list, any team there that stand out to you. Looks like Tom's already gotten his explanation for Illinois. I will accept that for sure.
I think you got to be really careful not to criticize other people top 25 in this day and age when the talent across this sport is so spread out. Like I'll ask you guys, where on your list were you like, okay, this team can no longer be number 1? Like my group of teams that I thought about putting 1 has ended because mine was down to like 7 or 8, and then like 8 to 40. Literally 8 to 40 is very kind of interchangeable. You can make a lot of arguments. I mean, Michigan, Illinois, great arguments there. What do you do with Arizona State? What do you do with BYU? Like, what do you do with Florida? What do you do with South Carolina? Like, all these teams that, like, some of them weren't great this year, but they showed some flashes. Like both those teams in that Cheez-It Bowl that I went to that, Tom's Illinois fighting out, like they won. There's so many interesting teams out there, but I think the talent in the sport is so flat now because everybody really feels they have a chance because they do. Because everybody's a little more even.
Yeah, I would much rather fill out a way too early tiers list than I would a top 10. Going along to your point, like there were 6 or 7 teams. I was like, if somebody throws them at number 1, I could listen to an argument. Like we mentioned, like Chip, you have Oregon at 7. I have them at 6. I think, Bud, you had them at 6. This is still an Oregon team that's got plenty of questions coming back next year. But the only 2 teams they've lost to in the last 2 seasons are a Washington team that lost the title game and an Ohio State team that won the national title. So this is still a very good Duck squad. I just think that this is one of the nice byproducts of the transfer portal and the NIL era is that we have a lot of good teams. There are a lot of questions that are going into next season, and I think it's what's going to make the 2025 offseason heading in so much exciting because we really don't know.
But come and try and figure it out with us. The 2025 offseason with the Cover 3 podcast, we will continue to be live at youtube.com/cover3. We will continue to deliver regular podcasts. Summer School will take you around the country with all the updates from teams from East Coast to West Coast and more. Scan that QR code on the screen and download the Cover 3 podcast wherever you get your podcasts.